Is this the Nazis invading Poland? Is it the Japanese attack on Manchuria? No, this is a United Nations peacekeeping force making war on the men, women, and children of Katanga. What was their crime? Like the 46 other countries that have gained independence since the end of World War II, Katanga, a portion of the Belgian Congo, wanted to be free and independent, but Katanga made the mistake of being pro-Western, pro-Christian, and pro-free enterprise. Why does an organization ostensibly formed for the purpose of keeping peace make war? That is the real story behind the humanitarian mask worn by the United Nations. In a world racked by wars, genocide, famine, and the threat of atomic annihilation, the United Nations represents the symbol of hope for a world that wants to live in peace and harmony. Hope for a time when famine will be conquered and security, justice, dignity, and mercy will replace the sound of soldiers tramping through the streets. To a peace-starved world, the United Nations represents the great peacemaker and the hope of the world, the only alternative to the bomb. The question is, do the facts justify the image? Have our hopes for peace mentally conditioned us so that when the wolf tells us he is a sheep, we see a sheep? Is the threat of the bomb posed to distract our vision from another very real threat, a threat more dangerous than the bomb? Is the UN a hawk disguised as a dove, making inevitable the very war every one of us prays to avoid? In order to answer these questions rationally, free from prejudice and prior conceptions, we ask you to assess the following facts, using intellectual integrity, not emotion. For almost 30 years, Americans have been conditioned to accept the United Nations as humanity's savior. The propaganda barrage began long before the birth of the UN in 1945. So successful has this campaign been that virtually no major American political official of the last decade has dared to challenge the UN for fear of committing political suicide. While most people involved in the campaign to sell the American public on world government were idealistically, if mistakenly motivated, others knew exactly what they were doing. The communists have always viewed world government as a stepping stone to world communism. Joseph Stalin, in his book Marxism and the National Question, laid down a three-pronged blueprint for bringing the nations into a world government and then using this as a mechanism for Soviet world domination. Stalin's plan was, first, bring all nations together into a single world system of economy. Second, force the advanced countries to pour prolonged financial aid into the underdeveloped countries. Third, to divide the world into regional groups as a transitional stage to establishing a world dictatorship of the proletariat. The American public has been misled into believing that the USSR had to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the UN, and that she remains against her will because of so-called world opinion. Such, however, is not the case. While Soviet diplomats played hard to get in order to wring dozens of key concessions from American politicians, the communists throughout the world, and particularly in the United States, were busy propagandizing for the UN. Earl Browder, former head of the U.S. Communist Party, reported in his book, Victory and After, quote, "The American communists worked energetically and tirelessly to lay the foundations for the United Nations, which we were sure would come into existence," end quote. Political Affairs is the official monthly publication of the Communist Party and establishes the party line for American communists to follow. Its April 1945 issue ordered American communists to propagandize for the acceptance of the UN as their key to world victory. The major question for us in connection with the San Francisco Conference is to assure the adherence of the United States to the World Security Organization. Great popular support and enthusiasm for United Nations policies should be built up, well organized, and fully articulate. The opposition must be rendered so impotent that it will be unable to gather any significant support in the Senate against the United Nations Charter and the treaties which will follow. 5 months later, the Communists issued a pamphlet entitled The United Nations, which explains what the UN would accomplish for world communism. It declared, first, the veto will protect the USSR from the rest of the world. Second, the UN will frustrate an effective anti-communist foreign policy by the capitalist countries. Third, the UN will eventually bring about the amalgamation of all nations into a single Soviet system. Dozens of defectors from communism who were trained by the Russians in political and psychological warfare have testified that the communists see the UN as a respectable front from which to conduct subversion under the guise of humanitarianism. The Russian political commissars taught their students that those who tried to expose the UN would be put in a defensive position, a position of appearing to be against medical care for children and food for starving peoples, and in favor of war. Prior to and during World War II, there were, for all practical purposes, no attempts to keep communists from obtaining jobs in the American government. Did communists in the American government exert any influence on the founding of the United Nations? In 1950, the State Department issued a historical report, Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation 1939 through 45, which detailed the policies, documents, and personalities leading to the creation of the United Nations. Of those men credited as instrumental in the creation of the UN, all but a handful have subsequently been proven to have been communists by the overwhelming evidence presented by the FBI, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, or in federal court by the Justice Department. Alger Hiss is the most important of those American communists who played the role of midwife at the birth of the UN. Yet Americans have been kept unaware of the crucial role Hiss played. In 1944, Hiss became director of the Office of Special Political Affairs, which had total charge of post-war planning, most of which was directly involved in the organization of the UN. Hiss traveled with Franklin D. Roosevelt to Yalta as Roosevelt's State Department advisor. At Yalta, it was decided to give Russia 3 votes in the General Assembly to 1 for the United States. Most Americans still are unaware that Belarusia and the Ukraine each were given a vote in the UN. This would have been tantamount to giving 1 vote each to New York and California. Hiss was executive secretary of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, at which key decisions on the UN Charter were made. This conference was so secret that the press was excluded from the hearings. When the nations of the world gathered at San Francisco in 1945 for the official founding of the UN, Hiss was there in the key position of acting Secretary General. UN apologists attempt to pass off Hiss's strategic position in guiding the conference by maintaining that the job of the Secretary General was merely to assign rooms. But, as Time magazine stated at the time, quote, Alger Hiss will be an important figure there. As Secretary General managing the agenda, he will have a lot to say behind the scenes about who gets the breaks, end quote. Hiss also served on the steering and executive committees which were charged with the responsibility of actually writing the UN Charter. When the conference was concluded, Alger Hiss personally flew to Washington, D.C. with the UN Charter. Hiss had played such an extensive and critical role at all levels in planning the UN that he was selected by the State Department as the man best qualified to present the UN Charter for the Senate's approval. Hiss then served as the Secretary General of the UN until Trygve Lie was formally elected. From its conception through the behind-the-scenes agreement